Hello, everyone. Welcome back to SEC Roundup. Joining us today is, as always, the founder of ICANN, Nick Morgan. Hey, Nick.
Hey, John. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too. And our special guest, Stan Yakoff, best described as an engineer who became a lawyer but still does a lot of engineering study. Stan is a law professor at Fordham Law School, and he's the founder of RegLabs.ai. And before that, he was at Citadel for many years. Hi, Stan. Great to have you on our show.
Pleasure to be here.
As everyone in the audience knows, AI is infiltrating all aspects of our lives, and the SEC is not immune to that, and AI is finding its way into the SEC, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So, Nick, do you want to give us a little context?
I do, and part of this is deja vu, maybe,
Yeah.
but with a twist, I suppose, given the speed at which these tools change. So what I mean by deja vu is back in 2011, 12, 13, the SEC was very high on a different set of data analysis tools that it had available to it at the time. So this was something they termed their aberrational performance inquiry, where they were using algorithms to look specifically at the fund industry and look for, as the name suggests, funds who were performing better than their peers very consistently over time. And the thought process was that some of those firms must be performing better because they were engaged in improper behavior that was, violations. So the reason I bring it up is because you didn't hear much about the aberrational performance inquiry after one of their sort of flagship cases that they brought touting this ability to use algorithms to sort through data. It was a case against an advisor called Yorkville Advisors, and it was very heavily litigated. And in fact, quite unusual for an SEC case. The SEC lost that case on summary judgment, which for the non-lawyers means it didn't even get to trial. The judge just threw it out before it could get to trial, which again is very unusual. So in that case, because that was an example that the SEC highlighted as what they could do with the right algorithmic data analysis tools, that's sort of a cautionary tale, I think. Granted, it was 13 years ago. Those tools are probably totally unlike what's available now. But I do think, and I'd like to hear Stan's thoughts on this as he explains kind of the world that the AI world that we're all living in, is if you rely on data analysis, is it possible that you end up with false positives? And I know we're all, we've all experienced AI hallucinations. That's not exactly what I'm talking about. But so I think it's useful to understand where the SEC has been in using algorithmic tools to assess data as we enter this new era, because they will absolutely be using AI. I'm sure Stan can tell us more about that.
And I just want to jump in for a moment, Nick. You also may remember back in 2006, an economist at the SEC did an analysis of opportunistic stock option grants. And that led to the large number of stock option backdating investigations that we saw in the mid 2000s. So
Yeah.
we've seen it before AI was a thing, but now we'll perhaps see it in super high charged environment.
Yeah. I thought you were going to say now we're going to see it on steroids, which would have been a nice segue into Moneyball, but don't want to jump ahead there.
That would have been a better way to introduce it.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be on here. I think with you all, I'm such a longtime listener and follower. And to me, this is like you're the Mount Rushmore, admin law experts and just litigation experts following all things from the SEC. And if that 2006 reference didn't solidify that comment, I don't know what will. I also feel like, you're both attorneys on here. Let me get my quick legal disclaimer out of the way, which is my views are solely those of my own and do not necessarily reflect any current or prior employer. And like, with that being said, I think you're spot on with AI. And it's interesting to, bring us back to the days of the aberrational performance unit, which I guess is like 2010. And at the time they were trying to identify aberrational performance, like whether it's an advisor's from, assets or just, actual fund performance, or even like volumes of trading activity. I suspect if you take that word aberrational, that word probably represents all the hallucinations we're now seeing. So this is the aberrational component of AI, which we probably see more consistently than the accuracy that we want to see. And I suspect what's cool with a lot of the tools today, which have made the user experience so easy for people to test, is they're now for the first time being exposed to the rudimentary problems of software and data engineering, which is the food you're consuming is only as good as the ingredients and the preparation that goes into it. So I have no doubt that if we had a chance to go back to 2006, before the actual aberrational performance creation, chances are, first thing you look at is, okay, what is the information we have? Is this normalized? Is this actually consistent? Did we have data continuously going back throughout this whole time period that we needed for? And the answer that the creators of that unit probably realized was no. And so they're like, okay, for us to have good tools, we're going to have to go back to the basics. And I think a lot of us today, regardless of how you're interacting with Gen AI or large language models, are realizing we're going to have to go back to the basics. It's a humbling experience.
Yeah. Your Tom mentioned the name of your current company, RegLabs.ai. You're deep in this stuff. And the Moneyball reference was it tended to be a cute pickup on your tagline, at least that I've seen, which is Moneyball meets regulation. What is it? What does your company do?
Yeah, so the reason I mentioned Moneyball is, first of all, I was watching that film way too many times on the flight commutes. But what's interesting about the statistical approach they take to sports is that it all has to start with data, which is your actual first performance and what you're doing, like your first bat at base, and all of that adds up. And in order to statistically be able to predict or make good judgments, you're going to need continuity in all that data. So our thought process was that if you look at a regulator as a composition of a lot of different data, which is the activity of what they generate, whether it's enforcement, rulemaking, speeches, reports, publications, guidances, FAQs. If we take the totality of this data over a very long period of time and do this at scale globally, could we then predict how they'll examine firms? So what we specifically do is we're now looking at about 300 regulators we're connected with globally, where we take 25 years of all this data, especially enforcement data, analyze it with their own natural language processing algorithms, and we could dissect what went wrong and why. And with all these variables, we could basically simulate how regulators will examine firms. And what's cool is that all of this is done, I should say, with using public external data. There's no firm data that's involved in this.
Maybe give us an example of if I'm an advisor and I have an upcoming exam, how might it help to know to have the output of your tools? How might it help me anticipate what the exam's gonna be about?
Yeah, I think there's a couple components. One is looking at it from the perspective of certain problem areas or topics that are likely for examination that an advisor will face. Like, for example, custody is a really classic one. If you look at the SEC risk awards, they've signaled some of the focus areas for what they're going to look at. But even if you took that data out and you just looked at enforcements for investment advisors, which all that data is there and specifically tailored to that exact business model and that exact regulator, you can see topically or thematically what regulators have actually cared about, which could be different than what they say they've cared about. So, for example, there could also be a gap in when they issue something versus what they actually enforce upon.
Wow.
And
So
when you have both of those data sets, you can
yeah.
actually start to notice some of that gap there. So it won't just be custody, but it's actually the marketing rule, and it's actually 20647 problems, right? And also like valuation issues. And
And I just, for those who don't know, I think it's fair to characterize the current way an advisor would prep for an exam as you go hire the people who have as much of this knowledge in their heads as possible. So people who follow what the SEC puts out, people who write about it and think about it, and you get their advice on what are likely to be the hotspot issues. You see these client alerts all the time, compliance folk come out with these. And so it sounds like what you're offering is an alternative to relying on any one or two or a team of human brains. And instead, you're asking your tools to have all of that retained, like all of that information retained in terms of giving advice to the client.
the thesis is like brains are biased and they only hold so much information for so long. We've seen this and performance. So we thought a couple things. A lot of people are also registered with multiple different jurisdictions at once. So let's say, Nick, your approach might work for someone who has local knowledge, but what do you do when you're really operating a global program and you don't have infinite resources? Right. So you think, okay, what can be common across the board, which means you now need to know those different regions. And here's the fun part. Sometimes they're not speaking the same English language you are. So you have to figure out, how do I translate that? For us, right now, we now translate 20 different languages. My joke is, if anything positive comes out of it, the number of words I now know in different languages is growing by the day. So I think there's an aspect of scale, which is important, but there's also an aspect of history. So, for example, you're both expert practitioners. When you cited 2006, I was smiling because I don't hear that as much anymore. And that's the sign of a really good attorney who knows like where precedent really comes from. And once you start talking about no action letters, which can date back to 1975, where, I was not in existence at the time, how do you think, like, how do I capture all that knowledge and information without having to rely on one person? Here's the other funny part. If you have that one person, good luck getting their availability for the time that you need them. They're probably stretched thin. So we need to think about how we do this at scale. And so we thought, let's build the infrastructure that enables us to basically be 24/7 solving this problem, and also do it in a way where the firm itself, like the end user, could actually interact with all the analytics and query and prompt them the same way that they're asking large language models, except we have all the context and the analytics behind it. Makes sure that you get actual deterministic and informed answers.
Right. So this is super cool and fascinating, and I can't wait to see how it gets implemented and used. But let's pivot for a second. If you're doing this, isn't it fair to assume that the SEC is doing something like this as well? And before you answer that question, let me just say, like I was using the example of, I'm an investment advisor. I'm getting ready for an exam. I'm going to go hire a compliance person, talk to my in-house compliance person, talk to someone at a law firm to try and anticipate what's going to come up. It's only as good as the knowledge in their brains. You've just explained how an AI data tool can be used to expand on that. So now let's flip over. I'm an examiner at the SEC. I'm going to go out and examine your firm. How do I get ready for my exam? Well, I look into your firm. I talk to my peers, people who've been at the SEC for a longer time. I look at our priorities, but the same sort of limitations apply. The examiner is only as good as what's in the examiner's head. So what do you think, or maybe how is the SEC using these tools, or how is the SEC likely to use these tools to either conduct exams or enforcement investigations?
Yeah, Nick, you're spot on with the wandering mind there. There's two components that are very interesting. Number one, it's the ingredients, which is the data that you have available. As a regulator, they have a pool of data that's much greater, a notion of data from that perspective that's much greater than anything else that we can have access to, given confidentiality and everything else. The second aspect is, even where you have that information, there needs to be a lot of skill in the preparation of these ingredients to get served a dish that you're really going to enjoy as an end user. And that is a skill set that takes a lot of dedication and education to be able to do. So just having the data is not a guarantee that you'll be able to get a really good outcome in the end. It has to be a combination. And I think a lot of people misunderstand that aspect. Now, in the SEC's case, you have Val, who's leading the AI task force, like, chief AI officer. Val's like fantastic. I think she's a black belt in jujitsu. So if anyone's going to be wrangling with complex data and annoying data structures, Val is, the perseverance and the expertise for that. And also someone who's been at the regulator for, I think, well over a decade as well. So having the institutional knowledge is tremendous, especially across different divisions and different emerging products, whether it was crypto enforcement, rulemaking, trading in markets, and having that market structure expertise. That's the type of profile that I think is going to lead to very successful outcomes. I think for them, there's a twofold challenge. One is making sense of the data internally, and number two is making sense of the data externally. Which one takes priority? My guess is going to be the former, but it might also be harder to deal with as well, given the way governments operate and all the processes and controls you have to have around touching certain information and trying to mix information with other information, and doing so systematically that can cut across a lot of different departments. um, I think that there's a lot more like technical program management that they'll probably be facing with, but in terms of opportunistically what's available to have technology that better detects fraud, I think is very promising over there. And I strongly suspect that's what they'll be looking at. And I appreciate I probably gave some high level themes there. I think pragmatically, a great example is identifying AI washing, right? Which I think is a very big risk. We see this actually tremendously with vendors, to the point where vendors or registrants, I think they'd be out of business very fast with some of the claims that at least I've personally seen. But I think a good example with what a regulator could do is to analyze disclosures and look at the language being used there and say, like, this is misleading or deceptive or omitting facts, especially around a firm's use of AI. And we've seen some cases brought in that regard. So that's a good example of what I would call low-hanging fruit that regulators could pretty quickly look at.
Yeah. I haven't seen reports of this, but that is reports of the SEC engaging with an outside firm that does AI work specifically. There's been reports, say, from the Department of Defense relying on Anthropic's tools or relying on Palantir's tools, and so sort of importing the AI toolkits from private firms. Is that a likely scenario for the SEC? I mean, it seems like, in other words, are they likely to try and develop the talent in-house or likely to go externally, if you have any view on that?
Personally, I think it would be a hybrid. I think where you could pair it, and it makes sense to do so as just the best efficiency and like cost effectiveness too. Yeah, that's if I had to guess on that.
Right. Well, I can imagine, Tom, when we were at the commission, if we had a question that required institutional knowledge, we would go down the hall. You remember the staff attorney on broker-dealer issues, Dennis, who had like banker boxes, and if you had a question about how broker-dealers, some mechanical aspect of it, he was the knowledge base. Wouldn't it be phenomenal if you were a staff attorney to pop up your SEC ChatGPT box and type in and then have that tool be accessing all of the data sources that Stan was talking to? I'm sure it's only a matter of time. Stan, do you see any risks or danger areas that could befall the SEC in attempting to use AI tools that people should be aware of?
Yeah, this is the like what keeps you up at night question that I often get. There's a couple components. Number one, my favorite one is cost. I think a lot of people don't understand how expensive it is to do this. Basically, for all these operations, you're talking about servers, databases, large language model processing costs. I feel like there needs to be a better way for people to receive a bill like right in your face when you start doing this and you realize like, wow, there's consequence to some of this activity. So I laugh when organizations will make comments like, oh, we're super productive because of AI LM use. And when you start looking at the topmost use cases, they're like, number one, please write my performance review for me to make me look amazing for year-end bonus. Number two, it's like, where should a team of 6 people go to lunch to celebrate like a good quarter? So when you actually look at like a lot of the use cases, they're still rather personal and there's a cost associated with this. So I think a lot of people need to pay much closer attention to that. And in that same vein, when people use LMs, in order to minimize costs, like ask yourself the question of, do you need reasoning done on this task or do you just want automation? So most
Mm-hmm.
of the time people just want automation, and automation is only possible once you've like cleaned and structured your data, which you don't like. That's an exercise you could do all by yourself. And honestly, you will have to do that all by yourself anyway, because the machines are only going to be as good as the information that's fed in. And I give this analogy of looking after your own data is a lot like raising your own kids. If you want to neglect them for 18 years, the amount you're going to be spending in therapy afterwards and rehab is going to be astronomical versus if you just took the time and made them outstanding citizens with the right behaviors and traits early on. So I see a lot of people having that. I don't know if I'm going to call myself a therapist in this regard, but I get a lot of these complaints and realizations right now. And look, it's still better to start sooner, but I do see a lot of neglect from an infrastructure perspective. And I sometimes smile, like engineering wise, to watch this experiment happen where you want to take non deterministic technology and marry it with data that people have like not touched in a very long time. Kind of reminds me of the scene in Terminator when you're trying to hide from Skynet and you think you're going to go into like an advanced defense system. It's like, I guess I'm spoiling I'm spoiling the movie for folks who haven't seen it, but you go in the cave and it's like antiquated technology from 40 years ago. And they're like, this is what we have. And in a lot of ways, those are the databases that are still running. A lot of critical operational processes at companies. Like some of the largest custodians in the US are still running COBOL, processing trillions of dollars a day. So good luck marrying non-deterministic LM usage with that world. It's going to be quite a risky experiment. The other component that definitely keeps me up at night is more around how a lot of large language models are trained. So if you look at data pools that they're subject to, there's the possibility of poisoning data and having that be in the pool that a model is then trained on, whether it's like viruses or cybersecurity malware coming in the picture because it hasn't been filtered out from guardrails that people try to build in for this information. That's a pretty scary thought. If you look at the notion that we might be running out of data publicly available to be training on models, that creates aspects of bias that we might then see creep in. And so that's also really difficult to cater for. And when folks sometimes wonder why the result might not be what they want it to be, you have to think about, like, I always go back to this cooking analogy of what are the ingredients that went into this preparation that you're then consuming.
Right. Yeah. I think the garbage in, garbage out problem is a real one. I think of other risks that everyday users of AI tools confront. One thing I can see is, you heard the term slop, AI slop. So this is stuff that's generated by AI that's just not very good. I can imagine, not pointing at anyone in particular, but a staff attorney over relying on AI to generate multitudes of subpoenas, for example. So I would call it investigative slop. And it really becomes, if the resources necessary to generate these things are, if you're made more efficient by the use of AI, it's going to be really easy to crank this stuff out. That doesn't make the investigation a better investigation. It makes someone very good at doing not good things. So I can see investigative slop being a problem as well. And then, again, just from everyday people using AI tools, I wonder if there's the risk of sort of a sycophantic AI tool that's telling the examiner or the staff attorney, oh yeah, that's a brilliant avenue of investigation to go down, and just being wrong. So, I mean, it's early days and don't want to be paranoid about it, but I see the potential for great efficiencies, but kind of going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, a lot of the algorithms are designed to like always answer you, which is tricky. It's like I was thinking about how the one of the original models of the SAT would penalize you if you were to guess wrong. And so you had to think strategically, should I guess here or should I leave the question blank? And a lot of that like penalization or decrementing isn't necessarily like built into a lot of the algorithms. And that can cause it to be like, hey, like the right way would be like, hey, I don't have enough information, so I'm not going to decide. We've actually seen improvements way more in this now that we're in like generation 5 of a lot of these models, but the early ones were just kind of designed to be like, guess the best you can. And that's maybe not necessarily what we actually want as end users, because especially as a lawyer, I think you will sacrifice the speed or delivery of the information you get if you can get better accuracy. That's my guess. Like,
Yeah.
so if I can deliver something to you in an hour that we have making this up, 99.95% confidence, and you're happy to wait an hour rather than get it in 30 minutes and be 70% confident, for instance.
Yeah.
And that aspect, that like precision trade-off, I think like probably more recently has been a greater research topic. And I think that will actually help with the output that we'll see, but this is still pretty experimental. I was thinking about some of your comments before around like how to avoid some of the hallucination, especially with your own data or like sycophantic responses. And I always just try to say like, look at the ingredients, keep them organic. And like the preparation is more homegrown as it is, which is like your own software engineering, which is deterministic. The more you likely can control the outcome, or at least be able to see where information went wrong. Not that I was trying to angle Whole Foods to sponsor you, considering how much organic, produce references we've referenced here, although that wouldn't be the worst thing either. The other thing that I would note, like from a risk perspective, because you're talking about efficiency, and I don't think this gets enough highlight, although I'm still trying to be positive, is the same way it gives us efficiency because we're good humans. Unfortunately, it also creates a mechanism for bad actors to be able to generate new bad actor tools way easier. So one of the things I always think about, especially with the regulators hat on, is how markets can actually be more vulnerable because the ability to generate a spoofing algorithm using large language models and the code for it is much easier than it's ever been before.
Yeah.
unfortunately. So how to think about making markets more resilient to problems like that is a pretty tricky question.
Yeah. Well, early days, but I think, probably if we asked you these same questions in a month, they'd be different. So maybe we'll do that. Tom,
Yeah.
I think maybe we leave it there.
Yeah, now this is terrific, Stan. Thanks so much for your insights. As Nick said, this is going to develop probably in such a way that in a month or 2 months, it's a whole different conversation. But for now, this is terrific. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, honor to be amongst legends. Thank you so much for having me.
Nick, until next time, great seeing you, and we'll see everyone else at the next SEC Roundup.
Perfect. Thanks.